Welcome to our first lecture, Introducing the Hebrew Bible. In this lecture, we're going to simply look at the way that the Hebrew Scriptures are laid out. We're going to familiarize you with some of the terminology, the way that scholars and others will identify portions of the text, the different copies of the text that we have, and just some general information about this large grouping of material that we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. So we're going to move through this, and I hope that you will be able to pick up on some of this terminology as we go. So when we look at the Hebrew Scriptures, we have three basic ways or sections, classifications, arrangements, if you will, of these books, these writings. Now, the first section is often called the Torah, or the Law, and this includes the books from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Now, in English translations and in the arrangement between the books of these sections will be a little bit different whether you're following a Hebrew arrangement and classification or an English arrangement and classification. So in the Hebrew arrangement, you're going to find the classification that is going to be like we have on the screen. So the Torah, or the Law, is going to include Genesis through Deuteronomy. The prophets, or the Nebi'im, are broken down into two sections, the former prophets and the latter prophets. And so you can see that in the former prophets we got Joshua, Judges, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And in the latter prophets we have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And then you have what is known as the 12. And these are what sometimes are referred to in English as the minor prophets. And these are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And so they're just referred to as collectively the 12 here when you look at them in this layout. Now, to compare what we've talked about so far with kind of the English classification, you would notice that oftentimes English classifications would have something that is equivalent to the Torah, or the Law, and that's known as the Pentateuch. And also, they would classify it as an area after that is known as history. And that would include Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And they would say that is a history section. That's not the way that the Hebrew classification does. And then in the English classification, you would also have a poetry and wisdom section that would include Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. And then you would have the major prophets, which would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And the minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So where the classification is different is separating the Torah, the prophets, and then the writings, which we haven't touched on yet from the Hebrew side here. But these writings include different books that you would find classified differently in the English classification. So, you have writings that are truth or dealing with issues of truth that are often classified as poetry or literature, emeth there, and you have Job, Psalms, and Proverbs under the writings, the Ketubim, and you have the Megalith, which includes Ruth, Song of Solomon or Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther. And then you have kind of other writings as well. That's your Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, and Daniel there. So you've got a different structure and ordering of the Old Testament between following a Hebrew classification and an English classification. Now, for us, that's not going to be very important for the purposes of our course. We are not reading this in Hebrew, so we are going to follow the English order. But it is important that we note that while we have the same writings here, the way the writings are viewed and the way they are put together in the larger corpus of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible will be different depending on whether you're using an English or an actual Hebrew arranged collection. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind as we go. Now, there's another way that you can also talk about or look at the Hebrew Bible, and it's as the Tanakh. And you have here, as we see, this acrostic using what would be Hebrew letters, and we've transliterated them into English, or translated, not really. Transliterating is when you take the equivalent language in another, equivalent letter in one language and replace it with your target language's equivalent letter. So HTNK is giving us, the H is kind of for the article the, that would be the first letter of that, and then T and the N and the K, where we would then add the vowels in there, an A, short A sound, Tanakh, and it gives you Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketubim. So kind of reminding you there the law, the prophets, and the writings. And so that's another way that you can look at it. So sometimes this acrostic is used to refer to the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. So that may be interesting for you. The languages, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the languages of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And I'm going to use Old Testament and Hebrew Bible interchangeably. What I'm referring to here is the content of our study this semester. The majority of the text is in the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. There are some portions, however, and it's Genesis chapter 31 verse 47, the second latter part of that, Ezra 4:8 through 6:18, and chapter 7 verse 12 through 26, Jeremiah chapter 10:11, the B, Daniel 4:2b through 7:28 were actually written in Aramaic. So the majority of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, but there are sections that are written in Aramaic. Now, Aramaic is a very similar language to Hebrew. In fact, some people will describe if Hebrew was Spanish, then Aramaic would be very similar to Spanish, like Portuguese is similar to Spanish. So, if you are a Spanish speaker and you encounter someone speaking in Portuguese, you're going to understand most things, and you'll be able to communicate to not perfectly, but the languages are very similar. So Aramaic and Hebrew are very similar. Some of the words, they follow similar rules. Some of the words are very similar. There are some differences. And to an untrained person, an untrained eye, you may not be able to tell the difference. So it is important, however, to realize Hebrew and Aramaic are different languages. though they are closely related. They are both Semitic languages in the same language family as Akkadian, which was the language of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, in the same language family with the Amorites, the Phoenicians, the Ugaritic language, the Ammonites, the Moabite language, and Arabic. These are all Semitic languages, so they have a lot of similarities. And so I've got a note here about the importance of studying the language. This is not a language class. You're not going to learn an Old Testament Hebrew or biblical Hebrew, but it is important if you're going to really want to grasp the text and what is being communicated. There is a lot of cultural understanding inherent in a language. So when you study writings that are not in your native tongue, in your heart language, or whatever you would like to say, the language that you were raised and reared in, and you start to deal with translations, we need to understand that we lose things when we have a translation. One example that I think is a good example of this, it's the difference between watching a show in color and black and white. And if you are reading from a translation and you don't have the ability to read the actual writings in the original language, then it's like watching a television show in black and white versus watching it in color. So what does that mean? Well, you can still tell what's going on. And I know many people probably don't watch old black and white shows anymore. But you can still, you see what's going on, you can tell the characters, you know the storyline. But the difference between watching something in black and white and color is that there is much more detail. There's vividness. It comes alive better. And so to study a text like this in English is fine. You will understand. You'll be able to understand what's being talked about, the concepts, all of these kind of things. You can follow the stories, and that's good. However, if you were able to read this in its own language, it would give another dimension to the story. So if you have the opportunity to study other languages, particularly if you're going to study written works in that language, then that's a good thing. So it gives you insight on the text that you just will not have if you only study it in a translation, in this case, English. Okay? All right. Now, the text is very old, and it has been passed down or transmitted over a long, long time. And this has been a very difficult task. The writing materials that individuals have used over the years have been varied, and just like anything else, they wear out over time. So you have to copy this text if you want to preserve it, and you have to hand it down to another generation of people to preserve it. And so because of the copying process, we know that copying things, particularly by hand, it's prone to us making errors in copying, whether we want to or not. If you were to take your textbook that you are reading for this class, and you were to sit down with a legal pad and start to copy that text word for word, and you did the best you could, and I had everybody in this class write that first chapter word for word on a legal pad and turn it in, I can guarantee you that somewhere in those copies, someone would have miscopied something. They would have made a mistake somewhere. It simply happens. And so since we don't have any autographs, and what an autograph is the original text written by the original author. There's no autographs available. They are all copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. They're very much have been handed down and recopied many, many tons. And when you look at these two copies together, just like if I would have each student in the class copy the first chapter by hand and compare them with one another, no two ancient texts are identical. The copies we have variations between one text and the other. And it makes sense because people are not perfect in the way they copy. So because of that, you have a field of study known as textual criticism that attempts to understand this process, the errors of the scribes, and try to figure out what is this error? How did it get here? Is it something that we can account for with a scribe trying to make a copy? Is this an intentional error? Is it just something that came about unintentionally? And so what we're going to do now is simply look at several types of copy errors that could happen. And the point of this is to let you know this can help us understand why we have differences in our manuscripts that are not intentionally different. Our manuscripts, the authors, the copyists rather, they were not wanting to make a different manuscript, but it was just a very difficult process, and it happens. So we're trying to understand that, and that's the whole field of textual criticism as it relates to particularly texts like the Old Testament, where there are multiple copies, and we can compare them to one another. Now, some ancient works, you don't have multiple copies. You've only got one or maybe two copies of the text, so you can't do that. But when you have ancient works like this, particularly in religious traditions where you've got lots of copies in different places, this is actually something that can be quite beneficial to help you get a grasp over what the text actually is or was. So, a couple of copy errors that we could see is the first is a didography, okay, and that's double writing. And so that's where you write a phrase or a word, and then you look up to the original scroll or the original writing that you're copying from, and somehow you end up writing the same thing again. You didn't mean to, you just simply did. And that could be the fact that maybe you've written a line, and the next line starts with the same letter, and your eyes accidentally go back up to that first line that you've already just written, and you're writing it again, and you didn't realize that. So that's repeating a word or phrase. So sometimes you'll see that. Haplography is the opposite of that. It's the single writing. So maybe there was a phrase that should have been written twice, or a word or a letter that should have been written twice, and instead of writing it twice, you write it the first time, and then when you look up again, you notice what you think is what you just wrote, but it's actually the second one that you didn't write, and you move on and write after that. So that's haplography. Copying two words as one or one word as two in the Hebrew language, and we'll look at this in a little bit. There are no vowels in the Hebrew alphabet, and that means everything is like an abbreviation or not an abbreviation, but if we were to take the vowels out of our words and you only had consonants, that would give you an idea of what the Hebrew language is like. So it can cause confusion. That doesn't mean there were not vowels that were sounded out or were not in the words. That means that the vowels are not in the alphabet. So the vowels have to be supplied by the reader, and you do that if you know the language. So if, for example, on the top of our screen we've got copy errors. If we removed those O's out of there, we'd have CPY, ERRRS. And we would, if we're looking at it, what would that mean? Well, we could probably, wouldn't take us very long to say, oh, that's for copy errors, and the O's are not there. They'd just simply remove the vowels, because we know the language. Well, the people writing the Hebrew knew their language, and they supplied the vowels the same way we would do if we took the vowels out of our own words, we could figure it out and would be able to do that. However, when you get copying it, that can cause some confusion, because we could have several words that the word is different if the vowel is different, but the consonants are the same. And so that means the way you split those words, whether you have two words that are supposed to be one, if you accidentally put them together, because the two words separately actually make a different word if it was one, or if you have one word that could make two words separately, then you can see how there could be some problems. And so the way you place the words is another thing. And then simply miscopying letters and words. Transposition of letters and confusion of letters. So here we've got, let me get there we go. Here you can see some letters on the text that are shaped similarly. Okay? You've got hey and chet, and the difference between them is one is connected here and the other is not. It has the little bit of space there. So the mistakes that could be made there are very, hopefully it's obvious that you could accidentally you could look at one and copy the other, because there are some similarities in the way that the letters look. So that's one of the other ways you could do that. Misdividing words. Now here we've just got a phrase. It says, what actually does that say? Well, the letters are all jumbled together. One of the things that we take for granted in a modern text is that we separate our words. But for us, paper is very cheap. And a lot of things now are on computers and typed, and the ability to put lots of text into something is pretty cheap. At the time that the Old Testament is being written, much of the ancient world, your writing material is not cheap. It's either going to be perhaps tanned animal hides that you'd be writing on. At some point, it could be papyrus, which is it's a writing material that is perhaps a little cheaper than having to put hides to write on animal hides, but it's still a long process. That's sliced. You would have sliced reeds, very thin, matted together, and it's expensive. And so the vellum or the animal hide is more expensive. The papyrus would be cheaper, but paper, even when paper comes on the scene, it's not cheap initially. Now it's pretty cheap for us. So you would write things and take as little space as possible. So what we see here is a bunch of letters together, but where do you divide? What does this say? Now, if you divide after D and after the S, then you get God is nowhere. If you were to divide after the D, after the S, and after the W, you get God is now here. So which is it supposed to be? Well, sometimes scribes didn't exactly know either, and they would misdivide words. Now, later on, as writing material becomes more common and it's not as expensive, you have the spacing start to be placed into words. But early, that's not the case. The other thing is called a gloss, and this is when you would incorporate a marginal note into a text. So say you have your textbook, or you have some book you're reading, or perhaps you're a religious person and you have a copy of your scriptures that you carry with you, and you have someone that gives you an explanation of something. And so on on the side of your text, you take a note, right? You write note, blah, 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 blah. You write something and you say, this is what this means. And now someone later takes your book and they're copying your book. This note on the side is called a gloss. It helps to explain the text. When you have handwritten books and handwritten glosses, sometimes in the copying procedure, the person who's copying that now has to determine, what do I do with this note? Is this note supposed to be part of the text? Do I insert it into the text? Or do I just delete it and get rid of it and not copy it to the next one? Well, we have copies of manuscripts where there is in an earlier copy, there's a gloss in the side, a little side note. It's not in the text. And in the next copy we have, that gloss has moved from the side into the actual text. And so this is when you have a gloss is when you incorporate a marginal note into the text. It is not something that is probably original, but it came from the copying process and the people who are trying to understand the text. And it makes its way into the text. And then we have some hearing errors as well. And so sometimes scrolls were copied not by having people look at the text. Perhaps imagine if we were in class and there were 10 students in class, and instead of handwriting from looking at your book to copy it, imagine we said, okay, we only have one copy, but we're going to make 10 copies at a time. So I am going to read out loud the text and let you write it down. Okay? That would be the possibility of hearing errors. So in Isaiah chapter 9 verse 3, the Hebrew text has not, but it doesn't make sense in the context. And the word for not and the word for to it sound identical. Okay, they sound the same. So this was identified. Scribes left the text because it was actually in the text, but noted the change in the margin. And about 15 times this happens. So we do have that possibility as well in the text itself. So just to be aware, there are some. That's another kind of error, copying error we could have. Now, I think this is interesting. So I just pulled up a couple of pictures here of the Paleo-Hebrew script. Now, this is the oldest inscription we have of some Hebrew characters here. It's kind of hard to see what's going on here. Just kind of look at the shapes. Maybe I can kind of highlight them a little bit for us. Okay. Here. And then this one is kind of hard to see. There. That's some of the oldest script we have. Now we've got, let me move along here. The Gezer calendar here, you can see we're working on some kind of a clay, and you can see those characters again, just to kind of highlight a few of them here, right? And it's very difficult to do with the mouse here. Just to give a couple. So again, you can see these different characters on the tablet. And so the Hebrew alphabet changed over time. And so depending on the letters that are used, you can give it an idea of how old that copy is. This is the Ketef Hinnon silver scroll. So this is some silver that was found very small, and it has Paleo-Hebrew script on it. Now, this picture is interesting because you've got a photograph here of the original, the actual artifact. Okay? And here you've got a drawing of the artifact in the center. And on this side over here, you have a depiction of those characters in a modern Hebrew font. Okay, so you can see there how a modern font for this ancient text is, and so you can see portions of this here, and I believe this is part of the Levitical blessing there. So that's I think interesting for us. Let me clear that. And then here is the Hebrew alphabet in a modern font again. And what this has is the English name underneath it. So we've got the Aleph, the Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samech, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Shin, and Tav. And again, you can see a number of the letters in the modern look very similar. Again, Chet, Hey, and Tav look the same. We talked about that. That was one is like this, the other has a little bit of thing, and then with the Tav, you've just got the little curve at the bottom, and you can see how you could potentially get confused with those letters as well. So the Kaf and the Beit sometimes can get confused, right? Because is it that or is it this? So that's another way where people could get confused. You can see Pei and Tet there could potentially get confused. And what's not on here is you've got a different, based on how these are pointed for the Shin and Sin, and that has different sounds and different things. So there are a lot of things that can be confusing here with the text, and so just be aware of that. That's all. All right. The Nazarites, when we're talking about transmission, the Nazarites are very important. The Masoretic text comes from these Nazarites, and these are the oldest copies of the text, the full text anyway, that we have. Now, the dates for the Nazarites are 500 to 1000 AD, so just over 1000 to 1500 years ago, which is a long time after the text itself is written. And here's what was going on. The Hebrew language is not being used, it's not being spoken anymore. The language is dying out. And so we've already mentioned that there are no vowels in this language. And so people are finding it harder and harder to understand the text. So the Nazarites say this is a problem. We need to preserve the way this text is to be read. So they said we need to add the vowels. And they did this via pointings, which are a series of dots and small dashes that go above, sometimes in and under the letters to tell readers how to pronounce the text. And so they had careful rules for their copying process. They were very concerned about the reverence for the text, preserving what's read and what's written, and they had to make judgment calls because that's what they had to trust their own judgment, their familiarity with the text, how it's supposed to be. And so all of that is to say, if we look at this same first verse of the Hebrew Old Testament, this is the text not pointed. Okay? And so we see here we've got these letters, the Hebrew alphabet here, and down here we've got the pointed text, and this indicates the vowels. And so you have the consonants here, and you have the consonants with the vowels there. So we have the pointed text. So if you're trying to read this, it supplies the vowels. And just my Hebrew is very rusty as far as being able to pronounce it, but we've got Barashit, Bara, Elohim, et Hashamim, et Haaretz. And so, without the vowels, for me especially, it would be very difficult to try to pronounce that. And my Hebrew is very, very, not very strong at all. So you can see the importance of the Nazarites in including the Hebrew text and pointing it with the vowels so that we would be able to understand the difference between these words and which vowels go there. And it's important for the language, though for us today we're focused, we're going to be reading everything in English, so it won't be that urgent for us, but it's important for us to understand. Just a few more things. We've got some ancient versions that are also important that are not written necessarily in the Hebrew, and it's some of these versions are old. These versions are older than the actual Hebrew text we have. So the Samaritan Pentateuch is one of them, and of course that since it's the Pentateuch, that means that we have just the first 5 books, and the Samaritans were a group of people that came about by intermarriage of Jews and foreigners in the territory of the northern kingdom after it fell to Assyria in 722 BC. The oldest part of the Samaritans' Pentateuch dates maybe to 1100 or so, but they believe it's based on texts that date to 200 to 100, or maybe 200, 250 to 100, 200 to 100 BC rather, for the Samaritan Pentateuch. Of course, we've got 400 BC. There's some differences in dating with some of these ancient manuscripts. So it's important as a witness to the Old Testament, and so that's a good reference for us to look at. The Septuagint is another. It's designated as LXX. The dates for the Septuagint, 250 to 100 BC. Some maybe 300 even as far back. Comes from the Egyptian city of Alexandria, and this is a translation of the Greek, of the Hebrew Bible into the Greek language. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. One is that we have lots of understanding of the Greek of this period. It was very common language. We have lots of manuscripts of this period. So when we get into difficulties in understanding what words mean, we can look to the equivalent place in the Septuagint, and that can help us to understand some of these words that have lost their meanings over time, that we just have forgotten what they mean. So it's a very important copy of the Old Testament. But there is some very different. There's some some large differences between them in some places. And so the book of Jeremiah has 2,700 words less in the Septuagint than it does in the Hebrew. So those are differences that we need to keep in mind when we're trying to get back to what that text actually is. Then we have the Targumim, or the Aramaic Targums, and they are collections of writings based on the Old Testament. They date from the early Christian era through, though parts of it are possibly earlier. And this comes from a time when most of the Jewish people understood Aramaic better than Hebrew, and they often provided common interpretations to the Hebrew text. In places, the Targums are somewhat of a literal translation of the Hebrew. Other places, they are just kind of commentary. So they are available as a witness to the text, and they can kind of help us maybe understand what the text is supposed to be in some places. But they have their drawbacks as well. And then you have an early copy from Jerome, who was a Christian who translated the Old and the New Testaments into Latin, and that became official for the Roman Catholic Church. But it's an early copy of the Old Testament into Latin, it's important because if you look back, the Masoretic text we have is only, it's from 1000 and Jerome is at 400. So he is 600 years earlier, even though he goes into Latin. And probably Jerome went from the Septuagint into into Latin as well. So, but it is an option for us to help understand what was there and if there have been potentially other errors in the text over time. Now, one last group we're going to mention are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is an important discovery for people who study the Old Testament. And so this was discovered in 1947. A shepherd boy went into a cave, and I believe he was throwing rocks looking for a sheep or something, and he heard a clay pot. He hit one or something, and it shattered. Something broke with it. And he found in this cave these pots, and it had these scrolls in it. And archaeologists went in and explored the cave, and they found a bunch of scrolls. And these scrolls date from 200 back to 200 BC, back to 68 or even to 100 AD. So about 300 years there, going back before some of the early texts that we have, and they were discovered in this cave. And they give a lot of information. There are at least parts of every Old Testament book, maybe not entire copies, but parts of it. And they provide a lot of information about this community at this site of Qumran, where the scrolls were discovered. And what it does for us is it provides insight into the process of how the text was preserved. Now, it says fragments of every Old Testament, maybe not of Esther, but of the complete Isaiah scroll is there. So it's very important to discovery. And what it does, when you compare it to the Masoretic text, you see that while there may be some errors and there may be a little bit of change that happened over this 1,000-year period, it's not very much. So there's a careful preservation of the text. People who were transmitting it were very careful to make sure that they were very careful with that. So, all right. Well, that's going to be it for this first video. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next video.